Hey everyone. Welcome back to Strange Mind 6. I'm your host Ruby, and today we're going to be reading more of Creepers, the Scarecrow by Edgar J. Hyde. But before we begin, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And without further ado, my dear friends, grab a snack, grab a drink, and sit back and relax. And let's get to it. Chapter 5. A Regular Farm Scarecrow. If the trip to town had been fast, the trip back was even faster. When he had made it home, David had thrown his bike into the shed and sprinted through the house, up the stairs and into his room, slamming the door hard behind him. His mind was totally jumbled, a mixture of confusion and fear. What could he do? Who could he talk to? He was pretty much convinced now that there was real danger close by. Two men connected with his house had both lost their tongues, and his dog's disappearance seemed somehow connected. Even if it had nothing to do with the Scarecrow coming to life, there was something going on that had frightened these two men, leaving both speechless and one in a coma. David sat through dinner in silence, barely touching his food, his mind preoccupied with the Scarecrow. He still hadn't said anything to anyone. "Well, at least we can all sleep in tomorrow," said Mrs. Davies. "Thank God for that. That rooster was beginning to drive me crazy," added Mr. Davies. David looked up, not quite understanding the significance of the conversation. "Well, someone better go and get rid of it before it starts smelling up the place," Mrs. Davies insisted. Honey, this is a farm. One more bad smell is hardly going to make a difference," Mr. Davies replied with a broad grin on his face. "I'll figure it out later," he added quickly, seeing the scowl appearing on his wife's face. David started to pay attention. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "What's going on?" Sarah chimed in. "David, where has your head been all day? Sometimes you don't even have a clue." "Your dad found the rooster dead beside the barn this morning. The poor thing must have just been too old. Probably fell off the top of the barn. Either that or your dad threw his boot at it at 5:30 this morning," Mrs. Davies explained. "Where is it now?" David asked, standing up. "Same place. Don't worry. I'll figure it out later, after dinner," Mr. Davies said, seeing concern in his son's face. But it was more than concern on David's face. David knew he had to see the bird. He had to check something out. After dinner, he immediately ran out of the kitchen and across the yard to the barn. "What's gotten into David all of a sudden?" Mr. Davies asked. He hated the noise the darn thing made every morning. David turned the corner of the barn and immediately saw the dead bird on top of an old farm fence. David looked up to the top of the old barn. The bird was positioned directly under the spot of the roof where he could be found every morning at sunrise. Well, where he used to be found. Maybe Mom was right, David thought. The rooster probably fell off the roof. But the more David thought about it, the more he knew it didn't sound right. Birds don't fall off roofs. David looked to his left, and less than 20 yards away stood the figure that was becoming more and more sinister, the Scarecrow. There it stood, harmless, looking enough but intimidating all the same. David looked again at the dead rooster lying in front of him. David stepped forward and leaned down. He picked up a stick and prodded the bird. It was dead all right. The rooster's head was hidden underneath its body. David used the stick to pry the head out. He flicked the stick and the whole bird rolled over. The rooster's head was visible now. The head and neck were limp, the way David had seen many times when his dad had decided it was going to be chicken for Sunday. His dad had shown David how to kill a chicken by wringing its neck and had even suggested he try it. David had always declined. He thought it looked so cruel. This rooster looked as if it had died the same way. Its head and neck were contorted and twisted. There was only one more thing to do. David had to look inside the bird's mouth. He had to know if this incident could be tied to all the other events. David dropped the stick and kneeled on the ground. With one hand, he grabbed the bird by the neck and lifted it. With his other, he pried open its beak. David knew exactly what to expect this time. There was no shock, but there was no fear. The rooster's tiny tongue was gone. "David, what on earth are you doing? Put that thing down," Mr. Davies shouted as he turned the corner. David was still kneeling on the ground and holding the bird by the neck. When he heard his dad, he threw it to the ground. "What's gotten into you, David?" "That thing is putrid," added Mr. Davies. David stood up, frightened and confused. Mr. Davies could see there was something wrong. "What is it, David? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It was only an old rooster. The thing was a darn nuisance. I'm almost glad he passed," Davies said, picking the bird up and throwing it into the garbage bag he had brought from the kitchen. David couldn't get any words out. He wanted to tell his dad. This was the third time today alone he had seen or heard about somebody or something losing its tongue. But Mr. Davies had almost dismissed Morrison's note as the work of a madman. He certainly wouldn't take old Jonesy seriously, and a dead rooster was not going to convince him of much either. David couldn't say anything yet, but he was so scared. He had to do something. He felt there was real danger on the farm. Mr. Davies disappeared around the back of the barn, where most of the farm waste was dumped. Carrying the dead rooster, David looked again at the wooden figure in the field. He was really frightened now, but he had to do it. He had to take a closer look at that scarecrow. David waited by the barn until he heard the noise of his dad returning to the kitchen. It was beginning to get dark now, and the kitchen lights were beginning to spread across the duskness of the yard. Once David heard the kitchen door close, he approached the wooden fence separating the yard from the overgrown field. He looked back toward the house. He could clearly see his mom in the kitchen cleaning up and his dad sitting at the table. Somehow, David felt a little bit less frightened and more secure knowing they were close by. He climbed over the fence. The grass and weeds in the field stretched up to David's knees. As David struggled to put one foot in front of the other, he wondered again why his dad still hadn't worked on this field. His mom had certainly nagged him enough about it. She had continually said that she was fed up with looking out of her kitchen window at the overgrown land in front of her. David looked up. The darkening figure was now only a few yards away. David inhaled deeply, as if trying to hold his breath as he approached. Finally, he was there. David let out a long gasp of air, almost in relief, trying to calm his nerves. He didn't know what he had expected to see, but as he scanned the wooden man in front of him, he couldn't see nothing for the moment that was out of the ordinary. David was no expert on scarecrows, but this one looked like all of the others he had seen on farms before. It looked like a regular farm scarecrow. Wooden head, broom handle arms, old suit, hat, plenty of straw, lots of straw. In fact, for such an old scarecrow that nobody had paid any attention to or looked after, it was in remarkable good shape. It didn't look as old as it had to have been. The old lady that sold them the farm had briefly mentioned the scarecrow, saying that it had been there when she bought the farm 20 years earlier. David was beginning to feel better. The incidents of the last few days were beginning to disappear in his mind as he looked at this unremarkable figure in front of him. David reached out to straighten the scarecrow's hat. He must have been a little nervous still, as his hands... Sorry about that, you guys. My dogs decided to bark. But, getting back to it, he must have been a little nervous still, as his fingers twitched and the hat went tumbling to the ground. David leaned down and picked up the hat. He was just about to put it on top of the scarecrow's bald wooden head when he noticed that there was some writing engraved into the top of the scarecrow's head. David stood on his toes as he tried to make out the writing, but he struggled to get high enough to read the words clearly. He looked around. It was getting very dark. He could just make out the outline of a small pile of bricks a couple yards away. David hurriedly lifted 2 or 3 bricks to the side of the scarecrow, putting one on top of the other. He stood up on the top brick, standing a little shakily and holding the stretched out arm of the scarecrow. David could now see the words. David read silently and slowly to himself. This land is yours for you to scare all beings who perchance do dare to disturb or threaten without pity this house's peace and prosperity. David's feet slipped from the top brick and he fell to the ground. He got up immediately, ran to the fence and leapt over it. In one movement he ran as fast as his feet would carry him toward the safety of the kitchen light. And that is the end of Chapter 5. Tune in next video for Chapter 6. Believe me. This has been Ruby, signing off.